Why aren't you a Mu'tazili? Quran first Muslim says. Because I'm Sunni. Why should I be Mu'tazili? This is the problem. People are not happy just letting you be. They're like, yeah, why ain't you a Roman Catholic? You're like, because I'm not a Roman. No, but why ain't you a Roman Catholic? You're like, but I'm not a Roman Catholic. But why ain't you? Acha, but why ain't you a Protestant then? Why ain't you Ismaili, yaar? You seem to, you have to remember, look, the Mu'tazila were an extremist faction in Islam. They were heretics and they believed anybody who committed a sin was no longer a Muslim. Um, later, what happens is, you see, you have to understand something. A lot of history is it's made to look neat and it gets kind of streamlined and presented in a particular way where it looks as though it had a theme playing out. But this is just in hindsight. It doesn't really work like that. This is just people's interpretation of what they took. Um, so the Mu'tazila, who are amongst the early sects of Islam, today the Mu'tazila, when people speak about them, they assume that they call them these super rationalists, which is stupid calling them that. This is just part of propaganda that latter day Sunnis had to come up with to resolve certain crises that they were facing within theology. It's not, look, the Mu'tazila are a clearly defined sect. Clearly, it's like the Shia. They are a sect in Islam that are clearly defined. And then they disagree amongst themselves over things. So, for example, the Shia are based, the whole split is based on the household of the Prophet inherit the right to rule. This is what it's based on. The whole split of Sunni Shi'adom is based on this factor: who has the right to rule? And they say that it must remain within the sacred bloodline. That is what defines a Shia. Sunnis do not believe in a sacred bloodline. These are the demarcating factors. Now then, Shia will disagree amongst themselves. Which part of the bloodline does it go down? Does it go down Hassan? Does it go down Hussein? Is it going to end up the Fatimiyin? Or is it going to end up down here? What are the rulings? What superpowers do these imams have? Are they infallible? Are they not infallible? Then they'll have things like, little traditions. When they pray, they'll pray, put a little rock and bow down on that. But some of them might kind of beat themselves in Muharram. Some of them may visit certain shrines, and these are permutations, obviously, of the Shia tradition. But then they may have certain. So, for example, you could say, well, mut'a, Shia have become identified with mut'a, temporary marriages. And they've also become identified with wiping over the feet as opposed to wiping over socks. Now, in all honesty, these things have got nothing to do with being a Shia. But Sunnis kind of used this to try to lay a smackdown. And then they bolstered it and they, put a whole propaganda campaign behind it to highlight it. So it got popular. Now, because you have to understand, the common public are just casualties of war. Nobody really, they're just they don't know what's going on. There is a theological turf war that is taking place, and the audience is the public. And what these people do is they play dirty tactics. And really, they will manipulate the public. So, here, let's say now temporary marriages. So, because this became something which in society, people, even though people may do these things, but in society, they look down upon it. It became a taboo. So therefore, they whacked it onto the Shia because the Shia had said it was permissible anyway. And they started saying, oh, look at them, look at them. Oh, that's prostitution. Ha 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 ha. Shia, Shia, Shia allow this. This was just a propaganda campaign. Mut'ah had nothing to do with being a Shia. Shia was about who gets to rule. It was nothing about how you practice Islam. So, for example, Ibn Abbas, the companion, was a clear proponent of mut'ah. He argued that mut'ah was halal. Many of the people after him argue this, that mut'ah is halal. Then it falls out of flavor with many of the people, but the Shia continue it. So they're just getting targeted as part of this theological turf war. That, hey, look at them, prostitution, blah, 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 blah. Temporary marriages. So in a similar way, the Mu'tazila, what defined the Mu'tazila was the fact that they said that if a person commits a sin, he is no longer a Muslim. This was what defined them. They also said that God has no real control or does not dictate any. You see, they said that God is not in control of the kind of evil that happens in this world. And also, what ties into that is that God is duty bound to serve what is always good. So these few points, which are a bit intricate. So, for example, let's say you did a good deed. God is not all powerful enough to. I mean, he is all powerful, but God is now duty bound to make sure that you find a blissful afterlife. Whereas Sunnis, mainstream Sunnis, always held that God is omnipotent and he's not duty bound. He does what he does, but he's not duty bound. If God wants, there will be no afterlife, for example. Now, according to the Mu'tazila, that's impossible because because you've done the good deed, you have to be rewarded. So therefore, there has to be, like, God is duty bound to recompense. And so these issues are what split them off. It was nothing to do with reason, nothing to do with, oh, they were rationalists. But what happens is, as Islam progresses and Muslims progress in the next 200 years or so, because a lot of Mu'tazila happen to be grammarians and also philosophers, they did argue some points with the Sunnis. So what they did do is gain the upper hand from a point of reasoning. Like, they made some of the Sunnis feel dumb on some points. So what the Sunni reaction was, haha, oh, but you're using your aql. And this was a dumb point. So obviously, when they said this to the Mu'tazila just owned it and said, well, yeah, because Islam tells us to. But Sunnis used to also own it prior to this point. But when around the 4th century of Islam, Sunnis started to, 4th and 5th century, Sunnis started to say, well, oh, because they were taking a little beating in some debates, so they started to say, oh, but you're trying to use your aql, your intellect. And they said, okay. Here, Sunnis started to say, oh, but the deen isn't built on intellect. And they started to pump this narrative just to get back at them. It was all a reaction. That's all it was. And later, subsequent generations just inherited this. But if you go back before that debate. So let's say you go back to the time of the Salaf, you go back to the first 200, maybe under 300 years of Islam, you will see that in the early times, many Sunni Muslims, in fact, some of the earliest people to claim reason and to own it was Sunni Islam. So this difference of reason was not a Mu'tazili point. Hence, all the great philosophers of Islam were not Mu'tazili. You know, Ghazali, obviously, before his thing, but Kindi, Farabi, these people were not. I mean, I suppose some people could say, well, some of them were from the Shia. Ibn Rushd, who was Maliki, who's, you know, somebody who I'm inspired by, take a lot of my room. He was never Mu'tazili. You see, it does not mean to follow your reason you are Mu'tazila. This is later on, people like Ibn Taymiyyah, he really spewed this on steroids. It's like he injected himself and he would just bash on anyone using reason, saying, oh, Mu'tazila, Mu'tazila. Mu'tazila had long died before Ibn Taymiyyah. I mean, they didn't even exist in his day and age. But this retrospective, it's like, I give an example. It's like today, if somebody says something, you start calling them a communist. Oh, you're a communist, you're a communist. I mean, communism isn't really around today. And by saying something, you're not actually a communist. You know, it's not like if you say, look, I think there should be, let's say, like in the UK, there should be a national health service as the NHS exists, and it's great. Now, oh, you're a commie. Why do you believe that the government should provide this? That's communism. You see, this is what Ibn Taymiyyah was doing. He was just like any person that was using his aql. Oh, you're a Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila has ceased to exist. Way before Ibn Taymiyyah, Qurtubi in his tafsir writes that, look, the Mu'tazila haven't existed for centuries. And he's from the 600s. He says that the Mu'tazila have long died out. But this is what they used to believe. So I hope that helps. And the reason I kind of went on there explaining that is because on many occasions, you will get this kind of dirty tactic by Muslims who can't handle your debate. So what they say is, oh, just call yourself a different sect and therefore we can disown you and we don't need to deal with you. Because if you say I'm a Mu'tazili, you say a bit salo. Why would I say I'm a Mu'tazili when I'm not a Mu'tazili? That's like me saying I'm a Roman Catholic. Why would I say I'm a Roman Catholic? So you say, oh, but you use reason. Well, what? Don't you use reason? I mean, what's that even supposed to mean? The Quran instructs you to use reason. So they say, oh, yeah, but do you say aql is over naql? So you say, well, is this in the Quran or Sunnah? No. Oh, who told you which one to take then? Oh, our Dada Ibn Taymiyyah. Well, last time I checked, Ibn Taymiyyah wasn't God and he wasn't the Prophet. He was, however, somebody who suffered from mental health issues and albeit, still performed on many rulings greatly, but he was someone who obviously suffered throughout his life, for God's sake. Why should we be taking him to be so supreme? Yeah.